Hello, everybody.
Turn this up in my headphones, Charles.
Yes, I will for you.
Run it back.
No. Hello, everybody. Welcome to a really special, really exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast. This is Charles, and with me today is none other than my co-host, Dylan.
And you can expect an A-space rousing episode from us today.
100%. You know, this is a huge day for any fantasy podcast. This would be a huge day. It's the day where we talk about The Lord of the Rings.
It's been a long time coming, Charles. And any first-time listeners who are just tuning in now, first of all, hello.
Hi.
Nice to meet you. I'm Dylan.
I'm Charles. Thanks for being here.
And you may not know if this is your first time listening that this is my first time ever reading a Lord of the Rings book.
As
reading
a
the Fellowship of the Ring
podcast host, it was quite surprising. I feel like the roles have been reversed. It's kind of poetic in a way that first Friends Pitching Fantasy played out the way it did. In Kingkiller Chronicles, it's kind of the reverse situation where I had never read it, and you read it and loved it, and you've been trying to get me to read it for a long time. And now here we are at the Lord of the Rings podcast, our next buddy read, and it's the exact opposite. I've been with these books forever, and Dylan has never read them, and I've been trying to get him to read them, and it's a really interesting situation we now find ourselves in.
Yeah, I mean, I'm lucky I haven't had my fantasy podcaster license revoked already by not reading these. I have watched the movies. I think I'm just one of those people who got into modern fantasy a la watching the Game of Thrones show and then started by reading some of those books and then just even after watching the Lord of the Rings movies, had always been a dark, gritty, modern, sometimes grimdark fantasy guy who, I don't know, never got around to actually reading the Lord of the Rings books. And I think that being podcasters now and feeling like we have to have some sense of knowing what we're talking about.
Some authority.
Yeah, a little bit of authority, I think, got you to read a series you'd been long putting off for your own baggage reasons.
Yes.
not wanting to read an unfinished series. And then I had to put my baggage aside for just a bit and say it's time to read The Lord of the Rings. And here we are. We're doing it.
And you know what? I think it's going to bring up some interesting perspectives. I feel like there's a lot of people in your boat where they loved, Game of Thrones and they've seen the Lord of the Rings movies, but for some reason the act of reading the Lord of the Rings books just doesn't appeal to them. I know I have other friends that are the exact same way, and I think it's just something to do with reading something that's like more high fantasy, something a little older, that might prevent people from enthusiastically diving in.
Yeah, I guess I could speak a little to what held me back. I think some of it is that when I've seen a movie or a TV show of something and they do a really good job of it, I kind of feel like, oh, I know that story now. So do I really need to rehash this in another format, or do I spend my time with some new stories and taking those in?
And how could you not talk about the Lord of the Rings movies? I mean, they were so huge and explosive when they came out. Everyone, beyond just fantasy enthusiasts, have seen them or at least know of them, and was quite the phenomena. So it's kind of shifted people's younger people who didn't like live in a time before these movies, or like were young when these movies came out. It's like kind of affected their willingness to dive into the books, I think.
For sure. And of course, I have had that sense that it might feel outdated or just. I think I asked you if the prose would feel archaic
Right.
as one of the questions during our Friends Pitching Fantasy episode.
Right.
And yeah, I don't know. I was put off, and I was reading a lot of modern fantasy without really knowing when I would get around to these. And I'm thankful for the Friends Pitching Fantasy format that we've decided on, because it's it's what finally got me to.
It brought us here. It brought me to
Yeah,
King Killers. It brought you to Lord of the Rings. It's done great things for us already.
for sure.
So that's
And
the kind of takes we're going to come into this. We're going to have a first time perspective, and we're going to have a more seasoned perspective as well. So you'll be hearing kind of two takes on it, which I think will make the conversation hopefully a lot more interesting. It seems like we're just adding to this large pile that is all the discussions that people have had about Lord of the Rings over the past like 70 years or however long it's been. So it's just one of those things where it's like trying to make sure our own perspectives are clear so that we can at least bring something unique to the conversation.
for sure, Charles. I mean, I've been thinking over the last week or so, what more can we say
I know it's
about
almost like an
the Lord of the
intimidating
Rings?
task because
Yeah,
we're not lore masters of Lord of the Rings, so
no,
we can't like teach anyone anything new about Lord of the Rings lore or bring up hot, trivia from the legendarium or anything like that. But we can kind of react to it from this modern setting of like where how we've come up in our experience with these books and how the movies kind of shaped our opinions of the books and how it guided us through our reading experience, and then kind of this retroactive thing of like, look, we're so deep into modern fantasy. What was it like to take a step back and read something like Lord of the Rings, which is considered like the fantasy book? It's hard to talk about it because it's like the series on which every other series has kind of been influenced from. So it's a tall
for
order
sure.
to kind of bring up a fresh conversation about it.
Definitely. And I see people bringing up this conversation sometimes on the internet where it's like, what would it be like if The Lord of the Rings was published today? How would it be received? And I can't think of a conversation that makes less sense than trying to have a conversation about how would The Lord of the Rings fit into a current genre that it played such a seminal role in establishing, like the
Right.
tropes. It's like, oh yeah, well, it'd be viewed as tropey. It's like, well, when you create the tropes, that can happen.
Yeah.
And I think that what we can offer, rather than necessarily speculating on how it'd be received if it was published today, is you can have at least someone in me that I've read a lot of modern fantasy before coming into this, and I can try to give at least one person's perspective on how well has it held up.
Mm.
Obviously, it's an extremely influential and legendary story in the genre, but how does it feel reading it now after reading all of the things that it's inspired? Maybe not all, but a lot.
Well, I'm so looking forward to having that conversation. We started King Killer with you being like, I have to hear your first impressions right away before we get too into the meat of it. And I know exactly what you were going through at that time. Before we talk about what was good, what was bad, what happened, we just got to hear what your first impressions were. I think you just got to kind of share with us what your experience was like picking these books up for the first time, being someone who's lived in fantasy their whole life and never read it.
For sure. Well, I'll say first things first is I enjoyed it more than I thought I would.
That's great
And
to hear. You can be honest. If you didn't,
yeah,
you can say it
I would
wasn't
be.
your thing if you wanted to.
I'm on the record defending Denna, so obviously I have no issues being honest, even if it might get me some pushback. So
Well, I'm
I,
very relieved to hear that.
yeah, I feel like some of my concerns about the prose and maybe the dialogue and stuff feeling outdated. There's moments where you can see that this is a bit older, but I think my worries were mostly unfounded. Like
Mhm.
the dialogue is sharper than I would have thought. It's not as dry as I would have guessed. And I'll say I see why this is a book that is still a lot of people's favorite book. Or I mean, this is just the Fellowship of the Ring I'm talking about here, so
Right.
take that for what it is. But I can see why this series is still something that even after reading some of the more modern stuff that builds on some of these things and subverts it, that people look back and say, no, I actually still like The Lord of the Rings the best because there's things that Tolkien does and I think had the ability to do here because it was so innovative and new at the time that you really aren't allowed to do to the same extent in a modern publishing setting. I mean, even just things in like some things he really takes his time with, like all the Bombadil stuff,
Yes.
and
Yes.
some things that he can really just revel in the fun of his world building in a way that I
Yes.
think you're not supposed to nowadays in fantasy. But weirdly enough, now that like few people are doing that, me going back to the Lord of the Rings, where Tolkien is just having so much fun with like telling you everything about this world that he's so happy to have created. I don't know. That was actually like weirdly fresh,
Right.
even though it was something that they had to stop doing in fantasy because it was feeling like it was being overdone, all this world builder's disease. But
Right.
I don't know, it was cool. Like, and it made some of the conversations that they'd have feel more real, I
Yeah, like more
guess.
lived in, more.
Yeah, lived in is great.
Mhm.
Yeah. Like just even when they're at the council and they're talking, and I guess this will have Lord of the Rings spoilers if you're listening to a fantasy podcast and you don't know anything about the story of Lord of the Rings through the Fellowship of the Ring. But when they're at the council and they're just trying to talk through the logistics of like, okay, what are we going to do with this ring? And they're coming up with all these ideas. The conversation around it very much felt like what I feel like a council of that nature would feel like. Even just when we're like, oh, should we have invited Bombadil? Like, like maybe I should have, but like we couldn't give the ring to him because he's in that. Like,
Yeah.
I guess
He
it's
doesn't really
a
leave his
yeah, forest.
perimeter.
Yeah, it wouldn't have worked. Like this kind of stuff. And it just feels like because Tolkien understands his world so well and went through this intense world building process where now people think of it more like, oh, like I need to just give the tip of the iceberg and give enough for people to assume that there's way more underneath the water, even though I haven't spent all the time doing that because I'm trying to crank out these publications here.
Right,
Like,
right.
it, you can tell there's some things that happen when you actually do have the entire iceberg fleshed out and are not afraid to show it
For
that I
sure.
think this book, I don't know, has the opportunity to take us into.
Exactly. And I think you touched on one of like the biggest strengths of this series is how much crazy detail there is into this world and how much history there is, how many different languages had been created for it, and like Tolkien has the whole history of every character and of all these lineages and stories and lore, and he goes crazy into it, and it almost like as descriptive as the book can get. There's tons of history that he wrote and is written in like Legendarium and Silmarillion and all that other stuff that he doesn't even need to bring up in the Fellowship, but because it existed, it still felt present in the story, where like people are able to be like,
Mhm.
oh well, Tom kind of stays in his own place, he doesn't whatever, and then you can go back and read all this crazy stuff about Tom Bombadil if you really wanted to, of like the whole lore of him. And that's what makes this series so great. Modern series, you have like magic systems and people make maps and like governments and things like that. I think Tolkien took it to an insane, crazy degree with like creating characters and histories of things just to have, like, he even has a history of the hobbits, of like all the families and like how they kind of split off and how some families treat other families. It's like, so it becomes so irrelevant almost immediately in terms of moving the plot along, but it's what gives hobbits like this humble, lived in, breathed in kind of vibe. So
For
yeah, I
sure.
mean, the something that I definitely see in these books more than in modern fantasy is just like how much time he spent into the building up the history and how much concrete, very specific history there is leading up to these points that makes the story just that much more kind of lived in and that much more epic kind of in scale too.
Definitely. And there's other things about Tolkien's willingness to take time in places that modern fantasy authors, for the most part, would not. Even just like with the farmer. I can't remember the farmer's name, Charles, but
Oh,
that Frodo had stolen. The
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Anyway,
remember his
eh,
name, but
um, point being that they like spend time and like have beer with this person,
yeah.
and it's kind of just like they're
They eat with his
shooting
family, and of
the
course he has like a farmer Maggot is his name,
yes,
and
yes, 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 yes.
he's got like a wife and all these kids and everything. It's like,
Yes.
why did he write all this stuff? Why does Farmer Maggot have like this whole family and like they farm specific crops and like
Yeah.
all this craziness?
And just the idea, there's lots of times during their journey so far in the Fellowship of the Ring where they just reach a point and they'll stop there. I mean, at times even for months. I mean, they'll skip through a lot of it. But I don't know. There's a patience to the storytelling
Right.
that I think you nowadays, if an author wrote some of those scenes, they'd be like, you can just like truncate this so much or cut this scene completely. And I see why that happens. In fact, that some of the faster pace that a lot of modern fantasy has is something that I like a lot. But there's something to the Lord of the Rings, at least in Fellowship so far, where it does find a way to capture that sense of being on a journey
Right.
more than really, I mean, anything that I can think of right now that I've read. Just the
Right.
idea that journey isn't just like hopping from this point where this really intense action scene happens and then a quick cool down and then another intense scene. I don't know.
Right.
Journey are
A
the
lot of
is
like
the
modern
moments.
fantasy seems very like action reaction and like it
Yeah.
happens very fast. The passage of time in the Fellowship of the Ring is incredibly interesting. It's like from when Frodo gets the ring to when he starts his quest is like a crazy amount of time. It's like
Yeah.
17 years. When in the movie it was like a scene, you know? And in any modern fantasy, it's not like someone gets told what to do and then waits 17 years and then goes and does it. It's like that never happens. So that is in itself is very interesting. And then they'll stop in places and like
Yeah.
it's like, oh well, it's almost winter now, so let's just kind of wait and wait
Hmm.
until like it gets a little easier to leave, and then we'll head out after that. And I'm like, wow, so they just like we'll just stay here for months and months, or they'll stay here for years, and it's just a really interesting because the movies are do a thing that's like, well, look, we can move this along because we're limited by we can't make a 4 hour long movie, at least for theaters. You can release it later, but you can't have like release a 4 hour long movie in the theaters. So it's like they did a good job of moving those spots along but the books tell it in a very interesting way of things take their time to be lived in and progressed, and it kind of adds to this idea of like, look, this is not just like a one and done crazy experience that a character goes through. This is like a thing that they are living in, and it's like their whole quest. And it, to me, it adds to that sense of like epicness that
Yeah.
a lot of modern fantasy, because it's so like gritty and intrinsic and focused, it doesn't really have. Like, I love Mistborn, but it never felt like epic in the sense that this was like some epic quest, old school journey. It's an amazing series, but it's more in like epic in their powers and what they can do, whereas this is like epic in the idea of a quest, you know, like going on a journey and an adventure. A quest is something that is very Lord of the Rings to me.
Those aspects are different from anything that I've read. And I also one of the classics I haven't read is Wheel of Time, so I'm not sure how it is or isn't captured well in that. But I'll say it was very strange because the books aren't that long actually compared to a lot of
No.
what we read in modern fantasy. They're far shorter than the Kingkiller
It's like a
Chronicle books
quarter
for
of the
sure.
Kingkiller Chronicle of the Wise Man's Fear.
The Wise Man's Fear, yeah. And I remember, so my hard copy I have in front of me right now, 531 pages. And it's pretty small. You can probably see it on our little Zoom chat here, Charles.
Yeah.
And or people can go to our Instagram at the FTF podcast and see, because I posted at least the spines of these at one point. And yeah, I remember thinking, how in this short amount of time has Tolkien made me feel like I've been on such a long, enduring quest? I'm
is
really
impressive
impressed.
because when you think of Tolkien, you're like, oh, these really long descriptions. You spend so much time learning about hobbits, and then you look at it, and it's a quarter of the page. It's like a quarter of the word count of Mistborn, or something that reads really, that wouldn't seem as verbose. And so you're like, how does he make it feel so long and lived in? His economy of words is really quite efficient, and I always admired
For
that
sure.
about these books, where it's like every scene has a purpose, is lived in, they take their time in it, and they move on, and they keep going through all these amazing different scenes and settings. Like, Middle Earth is so alive in Tolkien's mind, and it has such a long history that he can move through it and move characters through it and take you along in that experience of like, wow, this is such an exotic place, but it's been so carefully constructed to every minute detail. Like, Farmer Maggot has X amount of kids and whatever, where it's like, wow, this is something that has had a longer history than what we've experienced, and we feel that in the story. And I think that's what builds it up in its epicness.
That's well said, Charles.
Mm-hmm.
That stuff about the long descriptions, I think it is true.
Yes.
Which is weird to say after a lot has gotten done in a 531 page novel, to say that there's a lot of time spent on description of scenery. There is, though, and I think that's part of, I've been big on this, is something a bug or a feature? It depends probably on your own perspective on things. I'm more of a character person, so sometimes this imagery maybe doesn't do it for me as much as it would someone who's super into world building and the aesthetics of a scene and this kind of stuff. But again, that's something that I've been thinking, hey, if you're super into that kind of stuff, there's still not really anything I've read out there for you that's going to do it better than these books are going to do it.
Right. And I also think it's like, for the every detail he puts into like scenery and giving backstory to characters, like when actually there is something happening, he is very quick about it. Like, he will he's not gonna give you the like step by step thing of what's happening where it's like, and then he like drew his sword and then parried and then he dived into a roll and then blocked it and shot an arrow. It's very much like the story carries quickly in those moments, and the way he describes action and fighting and things like that, it's very almost like the way he narrates it's more just kind of the impression of what's happening, and we're not like getting exactly like the technique Aragon used to fend off the ring wraiths. It's like
For
he
sure.
like used fire and drove them away. It's not like he like was scrambling around looking for a thing of wood and then lit it, and like it was just very much like this is the flow of what's happening. So very
That's a great
interesting way
point.
to give that kind of, and that's kind of what might feel like older about it. Sanderson goes so deep into it, and then they pulled on this and pushed on this and burned this and they did that. Where it's like you won't get that so much in Tolkien's work.
Exactly. I was thinking of Joe Abercrombie, probably surprising no one. And Abercrombie will give you all the ugly details of what's going on in a fight scene, down to, people slipping and things like that.
Right,
Some of the
right.
things that are less pretty than than what you'd typically expect in a fight. Sanderson will paint you a picture that feels like it's taken right out of a great video game fight scene or a movie
Right.
or something
And it's
like
just a
that.
case of like an author writing what they love. And Sanderson
Hmm.
loves the magic mechanics of Mistborn and really spent a lot of time giving us how being a Mistborn works. And it's what makes it such a great series is that it's so focused on that. So if you're writing a story and you spend all this time creating this really specific magic system, this really hard magic system with all these rules, that you would dedicate time to explaining giving the blow by blows of the fights. Where Tolkien, who knows what's going on when someone uses magic? It's like I don't understand how the ring works. Like, who knows what it really does? It's not quite clear, and it doesn't matter because you get the sense it's very very bad. So it's like, and it can affect really powerful people. So it's bad, and that's kind of the difference. Tolkien definitely is much more of like a historian and much more of a guy for languages and things like that. So that's where he kind of channels his energy. And when you have masters in the craft that just choose different things, you get to see where how the priorities and someone's personal tastes affect their writing style. And it's really interesting just to see Tolkien write action versus writing setting.
Definitely. It was interesting. There's that scene where Legolas shoots an arrow to kill something and it isn't really revealed what he killed. Do you remember this?
Yes, he killed like one of the like they were getting attacked by like wolves or something, and he shot an arrow and it maybe killed one of them and that drove the others away, or he killed like something that was spying on them or something that was channeling all the energy that was forcing the other animals to come out, and it broke a spell of some kind,
Mhm.
or it scared them away. Wasn't really told. Like, was there magic involved in this attack or not? It's like, who really knows? And I mean, I do want to get into kind of the what worked and what didn't aspects of it, but um, let's get into some more specific like character stuff or like actual moments in the book. Do you have some standout, like what are some moments, whether they're characters or scenes, that really stood out to you as something that you really
Hmm.
liked?
Well, I can start with characters. I'll
Sure.
say that I think I appreciate Gandalf a lot more
Yeah.
from the books than I ever really did from the movie. I think that, or movies.
Hmm.
I think that you just get a lot more time with Gandalf, and especially to the point where this the scene in Moria where you lose Gandalf in the movies kind of just like felt like it came on pretty fast. Even in the extended editions, it's like, oh,
Mhm.
okay, like now Gandalf's gone. Like I thought he was like a big part of the story. um, but in the books, I felt like we'd known Gandalf for so long by the time
Right.
that we'd got in there that the loss of Gandalf as
And
this
how crucial
calming
he is
leadership
also.
presence, who, yeah, is super crucial. And I think, you're in Frodo and the Hobbit's lack of shoes, I guess, and you're you're in their hairy feet,
Yeah.
and you get to see people like Gandalf through their eyes in a way where it's like, oh, like, okay, Gandalf's around, like I feel so much safer now.
Yeah.
And then I guess I felt the loss of Gandalf so much more in the books at Moria than I felt in the movies. So that's something that stands out to me.
I can see that. And I agree. If I had to pick like a best character in this book, Gandalf just gets all the best lines and he's in all the best
Hmm.
scenes. It's hard not to pick him. And I would agree because where I come from, my history with Lord of the Rings as a story is, the books when the movies came out, it was like the early 2000s and we were in like junior high or something, maybe even younger. And that was my first impression, and then that was the first time I read the books. And then this is
Hmm.
my third time reading the books. And I'll say one of the things, like, when I first read the books and first watched the movies, I was so much younger. There was a lot that I hadn't quite figured out yet, just from lack of experience in reading fantasy, of like, how powerful are these characters? Like, why did things happen the way they did? Going back now for my third time after being a much more experienced like fantasy reader and like someone who's thought more about fantasy series than the average person, I'd say, to read it now in that context, it's like I totally, like, the books don't really, because like we're going, Tolkien has these things lived out. Gandalf has a huge history in terms of like how epic he is, right? And like how
Hmm.
every character knows who he is, how every character has reverence for him, how he's somehow a force of nature that everything that is good has nothing but respect and admiration for. And everyone's like, oh, well, if Gandalf is having problems, then it's bad. And you have just like
Yeah.
an entire history of that being lived in these books. The books also take the time. It's those 17 years where Frodo was like terrified to leave the Shire because he hadn't heard from Gandalf, and it was like a big deal for him to leave without it.
Hmm.
And they go through all these adventures just wondering where Gandalf is, and it became a whole thing. They touch on it in the books, but not to the extent. Like, you have
You
no
mean in the
idea that
movies?
in the movies, and you have no idea that Gandalf is this force of nature that he is in the books when you watch the movies. At least when I was,
Yeah.
younger, it's like you get that he's like a wizard, but you don't get that he's like one of the wizards. So the loss in the book, and he, like, in the book, he just takes charge more quickly and more
Agreed.
strongly. He's definitely seen as the leader, and he's definitely the one that knows the most. And like, he's the only one that's like, I've like been through the gates of Moria and it's pretty messed up there. Trust me, you don't want to go there.
Hmm.
And then like even the elves, he's a friend of the elves, which is a very rare thing to be. So definitely like getting to have more of an understanding of Gandalf added a lot of value to these scenes that we're familiar with in the movies that we're now reading in the books. It definitely makes it more impactful. I gotta say, my favorite scene in all these books absolutely has to be the Mines of Moria. I mean, reading
Hmm.
that, I had so much fun reading that. Even though I've like watched that scene a million times, I've read it twice in the books already. Like, reading it now, I just forgot how well paced it was and how genuinely like intense it could get.
Yeah.
I was like, that holds up against any modern fantasy. I mean, it all does, obviously, but this is like such a strong scene, especially for Tolkien, who's not really known for writing action. It's like, come on, this is the definition of epic to me. I mean, that where they're in the tomb and they're reading the journal, and it's like, we cannot get out. The end comes, drums in the deep, they're coming. And then, as he's reading it, they're they're like the drum. They hear the drums and they're going through all of that, and then the orcs attack, and then like everyone, like Frodo got stabbed, and then
Hmm.
Gandalf. I love that scene where they were like Gandalf says like go ahead, and then he like just comes like flying down the stairs. He's like, whoa, that was crazy, man. Like I almost died back there. Like that was such a fun moment where he was like, whew, that was a close one. I almost met my end there, and I met my match in there, but somehow I survived. And then you get the Balrog, and only Legolas knows the like absolute horror of the Balrog, and that's such a great moment where he's like, fly, like get out of here. And then he's just like, he doesn't say shall not pass, he says you cannot pass.
Yeah, I know.
Which you got to give it to the movies for changing it. Like the movies was badass.
They change it in the movies. It's
the
shall
movies
not in the
is
movies?
shall not pass, and the books is
Oh,
you
really?
cannot pass.
Oh,
Yeah. So
interesting.
it's like that whole you cannot pass thing is so great. I mean, that just to me, the whole atmosphere of that scene and the stakes in that scene and the kind of almost like horror aspects of it came out of nowhere too. And it's just a really entertaining part of the book.
It really is. I even enjoy when they're trying to get in.
Yeah.
And I'll say that is something that felt like a throwaway scene in the movies, and it doesn't get to take its time for them to figure out
Right.
the riddle. It just kind of I watched the scene again in the movies because I was like, I remember this being different. I think in the movies, Frodo is just like, oh, like what is it again?
What's the Elvish
And
word
he's
for
like, speak
friend?
for
And
yeah. He's like, what's Elvish?
Meladon, and then it opens the door. Yeah.
Yeah, but in the books, it gets to be the kind of this long process of all of them mulling it over and trying to figure it out, and then they circle back to it. And I think Gandalf
Yes.
just is the one who figures it out in the
Yeah, of
books,
course.
which feels way more appropriate. I guess they were just trying in the movies to make Frodo this like protagonist who does stuff or something, but it makes way more sense the way it's done in the
And
books, and it's a
even
more
like
funny,
leading up to
interesting scene.
deciding to go to Moria, like they try, like in the movies, it's kind of like a throwaway scene where they're in snow and they're like,
Mhm.
"There's too much snow. We have to go to Moria." And he's like, "Okay." And then like Gimli's the one that suggests it, and then they're like, "Okay, it's a bad place, but we'll go." Where in this, it's like Gandalf's like, "I think we gotta go there," and Aragorn's like, "No way are we ever gonna go there." And they like tried so hard, and they went so far out of their way to try and go up this mountain, and then they had to double back, and it was like they tried everything in their power to avoid Moria at all costs. And they even talk about it in Rivendell. The dwarves are like, yeah, Balin went there and we haven't heard from him in a long time. So it's like, man, that place is, there's some real evil going on in there. They dug too deep. So I don't know. It's just all the stakes behind it were being raised even since Rivendell. So I feel like that's kind of missed in the movies, and that adds to the value of the payoff of that scene in the books.
That's totally fair, and I'll say something that seems missing from the books that felt like a cool part of the movies is this Legolas Gimli like rivalry doesn't
Right.
really seem to be present in the books, which that surprised me. There's
Yeah,
a
I mean
little
they're
in
a
the
little bit when they
background.
get to
Yeah.
Lothlorien, and like there's the
Yeah.
whole thing of like bandaging the eyes, and then you see Gimli kind of coming around and being just in awe of Galadriel, and that kind of gets him buddy with Legolas. But they haven't really fought anyone yet. You know, they haven't killed any orcs yet, so it takes a little time for them to get to that point where they have a nice rivalry going, because they haven't really gotten into too much combat yet. It's been a lot of traveling at this point, besides Moria.
I feel like there's a little more, and maybe it's less subtle. There's a little more in the movies of just like, I won't be traveling with an elf kind of talk, which
Yeah.
I don't know if that's an actual anything resembling a quote, but it just feels like Gimli and Legolas were all in on that kind of attitude in the movies, and
Yeah,
in the
those are some
books you
great
can
comic
see,
relief moments too. Like, I think
yeah,
that's just the charisma of that actor that played Gimli coming through. And maybe we'll see, I can't remember, maybe we'll see more of it in Two Towers when they actually go off to war and go into battles and things like that. We might get to see a little more competition. But yeah, I felt like those characters really weren't all that present. Like they were written into the
Hmm.
Lothlorien scenes and everything, but that didn't really have a whole lot of weight for me. Like I understand the significance of like giving the hair and everything, and the whole thing with the bandages was kind of interesting. It and the idea that they were all going to wear the bandages together to save face for Gimli, as a group. And even Legolas was like, "I don't want to wear a bandana. I want to see this
Hmm.
place." And they're like, "No, we either all do it or we don't go," which was an interesting thing that I feel like a company would have to kind of deal with. So I like those things, but those characters I could take or leave in this book, honestly.
I'll say it feels a little bit like in the Fellowship of the Ring that Tolkien just wanted someone from he wanted an elf, he wanted a
Yes,
dwarf,
yes.
he just wanted them all in the mix so he could use them to establish what a dwarf's place in this world is, what an elf's place in this world is, and I'm sure they'll flesh them out more, but
Yeah, he's
they
got
kind of felt
plans
like
for them
stock
coming up.
characters early on, and
Right.
I mean the movies they stick out in my, especially Gimli, I guess, stick out in my head as these very memorable characters. So it's
Yeah.
interesting to see. Usually you get a more fleshed out version in the book, but I feel like in some ways we get less fleshed out versions of those two
Yeah, that's
characters
very
at
interesting. I
least.
think they just had like A-list talent play those characters, and it's like they're so good. Gimli in the movies, he just takes an axe to the ring, right? The council of Elrond, and like the
So
axe
good.
just like explodes, and everyone's like, "No, you can't just hit the one ring with an axe." It doesn't
Like no
work.
one thought of that before. It's a
He's
great.
like, "So what are we waiting for?"
Uh,
Which
so
is
funny.
a fun moment, and no, I did like the Council of Elrond though, but in both. But yeah, he didn't really give as much attention to characters like Gimli and Legolas than he did to Frodo and Gandalf and like these other characters. So we'll see how that changes in the next two books. But yeah, those two, although I love them as characters, there's not a lot of going on with them that I would consider them like one of the better characters in these books.
Well, Charles, I don't think either one of us has uttered the name Sam to this point, and that's probably criminal this deep into the podcast. I know that
There's so
he's
much we
one of your
haven't talked
favorite
about yet.
characters
Yeah, I love
because you talk,
Sam.
yeah.
Sam's great. He's still in his very humble beginnings in
Hmm.
these moments, so I think his real strength comes in like the third book. But I do love his character in these. Like he is one of the few people that really has a good sense of understanding and practicality around like their mission and what they need to do. And he was thinking about it like at the in the end of this book where he's like Frodo's not just going to like run off. He's probably going to go take a boat. And he was like the only one that was able to like go and find him. And I just love all the little touches to his character. Like he uses like a frying pan as a weapon, and he just loves the horse Bill and he's
Yeah,
very loyal
that
to
was
the
a sad
horse.
moment
Yeah.
with Bill.
They do have that moment in the movies though where they let him go, where they let the horse go. Um
Well, I guess I mean that's one of the things you get with a book where you can actually see
yeah.
the time where
Yeah.
you see like, oh,
The
Sam
horse
is gonna
has this
take
whole
this really
backstory of he
hard.
was raised by this guy in
Yeah.
Bree and was like emaciated, and then like they brought him to Rivendell and he ran off with Tom Bombadil's horses, and it was like this whole even
Yeah.
Mary's horses had backs like they he gave the whole story of the horse like, and then they ran off back to Tom Bombadil and lived in that land
Yeah.
and then came back at some point later and lived happily ever after. You're like, okay, cool. Good to know that about the horses. So no, I do love Sam. He's just still in his very beginnings here, but he is definitely the what do they say in like sports or whatever? It's like the guy to look out for. He's
Like a
definitely
dark horse.
yeah. You definitely want to look out for
All
Sam.
the
He's
horse
gonna be
talk here.
yeah. Oh Yeah, he's definitely going to be making some big moves coming up. But love
Yeah,
Sam. Very
keep an
nice,
eye on
humble
him.
guy. There is kind of that weird thing where it's like Frodo's like his master, which is
Yeah,
like,
what's going
yeah.
on with that, Charles?
Well, I think it's just old and like Frodo is like the rich guy and Sam's like the working class guy, and it's just like
Mm.
I'm your gardener, you know. I'm not like your buddy and pal, but then they become more friendly and more and pals towards the beginning of the journey all over those 17 years, I guess. So um and then Gandalf kind of tasks Sam with following Frodo. So it kind of starts with that's like it's my job to keep you safe and like to
Mm-hmm.
protect you, and that's kind of how it starts. But it's nice to see that whole like servant master thing kind of fade away, and then like two buddies that like love each other kind of take over. So it's a nice thing to see transition, but that's kind of a weird thing that didn't make it into the movies that I could see. Um,
Mm. I feel like I vaguely remember some master talk going on, but it felt very subtle if it was there at all. Like
yeah, they mentioned it a
I
couple
wasn't like
times
taken
more in
by
the beginning.
surprise
No,
in
it's
the
not
books.
shocking or anything or offensive or anything. It's just like weird to think of Frodo and
Mm.
Sam's relationship like Frodo is Sam's master. Like
Yeah.
master in the terms of like if he was a butler, it's like, oh, Master Baggins. It's like
Hmm.
because I guess it's like he's the most noble family or whatever. But no, it's I like them. Another character that I really love that we haven't spoken a word of is Boromir. I think
Mm.
outside of maybe Frodo and Gandalf, Boromir is the most like developed character and as the most is one of the more proactive characters. He brings a lot of great um thoughts into this. He's kind of like the voice of the audience in a lot of ways. He's like, look, this is a
Hmm.
really powerful tool. We need power to defeat the Dark Lord, so let's use the ring to do what we need to do and then destroy it. So at some level, you're like, yeah, like you can see how someone would think that would be a good idea. If even though we know like the One Ring is like really, really bad, it is a powerful tool. So I always kind of liked Boromir as being that kind of voice of a little more proactive approach to how to handle the One Ring and how he kind of put him at odds with with Frodo.
I agree with that. You know, I'm one for the morally gray characters, and I'd say in the absence of, there's very little Gollum in this
Yes.
book. So, and he's lurking in the background, but in the absence of very much Gollum, uh, Boromir is our most morally gray character in this book, and he does have something of a point from our perspectives, I think, as readers, unless we're super well educated on the ring and its powers and things like that. At least me, I was finding myself a little more on on Boromir's side than I felt in the movies,
Right.
because I think part of it is just I spent a lot more time reading this book than I spent watching the movies. So there's part of me that was like, oh, like we're going through all of this just to like go into the enemy's territory, which is going to happen
Yeah.
2 books later, and we're gonna try to throw this in a volcano,
Yeah,
basically.
Boromir's like the only
It's
person who's
like,
like, so the plan is to go
yeah.
into Mordor with the ring with hobbits. That's the plan. We will most definitely fail that mission. That will
Yeah.
never work.
And
Which is like
I
a
I get it.
very fair take to have.
For sure. I get it. And I mean, maybe I also display the folly of man, but I'd be like, look, if this thing is so powerful, then it's hard not to want to just use it to destroy your enemies. And I,
Right.
I get
And
that
it's like you're
underlying.
kind of forced almost at a certain point, because to me I would have never agreed to a plan that's like, let's just go into Mordor. I'm like, it's impossible. If you take the
Mhm.
ring into Mordor, it will get found and then it will be used against us. Like, I don't think Boromir ever expected that plan to succeed. And he's genuinely worried, like, you're just delivering it to Mordor. Like, there's no way these hobbits can pull off this task, which is a very fair thing to think. So he's
For
like, if
sure.
we can't destroy it, and we can't, you know, and we can't have the enemy take it, and there's no point in hiding it because he'll get it eventually. If we just try and keep it in Rivendell, it will eventually get taken. Then we have no choice but to use it. We have to take that risk. And I think he always knew it was a risk, but it's one of those things where it's like, it it's either gets taken or we don't. There's no way in which we cannot use it because it's just going to get taken. So we may as well use it, which was a very fair point.
I feel like he totally does have. He has what feels like a fair point, but there's some sort of way that Tolkien establishes how clearly it is wrong to be tempted by the ring and to use the ring through the
Right.
voices of such wise characters
Yeah.
that I'd say in some ways for me as someone really more interested in the gray than I am uh, the sorry, I was trying to think of a pun with like Gandalf the Grey, but it didn't come. So I was like, I'm more
You tried.
interested in the morally gray than I am this clear right and wrong, where I would have enjoyed it even more personally if there was a bit more to go on with Boromir that hey, maybe that isn't all right, but it's just all the wise characters are like, look, I've been around this
Yeah.
many
I mean, you
years, I
have to
don't know,
think in order for
thousands.
like gray morality to exist, like Boromir is probably as edgy as it got in fantasy for a
Hmm.
character for a long
Yeah,
time. And then you have to have many characters like Boromir to be written before we get characters in the modern day.
like Logan Nine
Like,
Fingers.
yeah. I think one of my biggest this kind of touches on one of my biggest kind of, not like criticisms, but one of my least favorite things about these books is like how power even works. Like, how does the One Ring even work? Like, we know from the movies the ring is so obviously bad because everyone that holds it gets this like creepy look and starts acting creepy and weird, because like they go through this whole prologue of showing Isildur hold the ring and he's like, no, I won't destroy it, I'll keep it for myself. It's like he acts very weird. So it's like, okay, well, we know that that's it. But Frodo like chills with it for 17 years and is totally cool. And like Tom Bombadil puts it on and takes it off and he's like, oh, this is a fun thing. And like all this weird stuff happens with it. And Gandalf's like, I really shouldn't take it. It's not anything where it's like, don't tempt me with that. Anyone that touches it will turn evil, except for you, hobbits. So it's like I don't. There's a lot of the magic of the One Ring that I don't really understand how it works, and I think that's kind of what took away. It's like, how would Boromir use their ring to fight Sauron? Like, the ring makes you invisible, maybe, or it, like, heightens your powers. Like,
It does
it,
make you invisible.
it's one of those things that I felt very bizarre on. And then we talk about things like the ring wraiths. It's like, are they epic or are they nine people that can't hunt four hobbits? It's like, like, what can and can't they do? Like, can they, like, a little fire scares them? They can't come out in the daylight. Like, what are these things? And like, why is Sauron up in his castle? Why isn't he like walking around, like, talking to people and doing stuff? It's like, what can and can he do? Like, he's omnipotent and can look everywhere, but for some reason can't find the ring ever. He like can't be sure of where it is, even though Frodo's had it this whole entire time, and he knows the name Baggins and he still can't figure it out. So that, I'm sure it's all explained in like the deep lore, but in terms of like servicing the plot, for me it left me with a lot of questions even after my third time reading it, of like, what are the stakes here? How powerful are these people? Like, what's really going on? Like, what is actually bad about the ring besides it corrupts people and ultimately brings them binds them to Sauron's will, I guess. That's like the temptation of power. I'm not sure.
I see where you're coming from, Charles. I didn't think I'd have to defend Lord of the Rings against you here, Charles. I I think maybe I found myself a little more generous about that. I guess I was wondering the same thing. I was also thinking, hey, all we've seen this thing do is that it can make people invisible. So there was a part of me that was like, watch out. If Boromir gets the power of invisibility, the world is doomed.
Right.
But I know that there's a piece, and there's this very soft magic system where the problems are allowed to be hazier. The solutions just can't be. So I'm willing to buy that, okay, there's something about this thing where, especially I assume if Gandalf gets a hold of this thing, right, whatever way it would compound his abilities would be
exactly. That's what they say.
Up.
They say it's like the more powerful the person that wears it, the stronger they are. So that's why if Gandalf were to wear it, it would be potentially disastrous, but why hobbits can have it and wear it because they're not powerful in the like sense of they have no magic, they have no strength, but they are like honest, kind, humble creatures that are noble, and so that's what makes them good ring bearers. Whereas Gandalf would be a terrible ring bearer because he has so much power that he could get binded by Sauron and through this ring. So I get it, but the rules were never like concrete enough that I'm even like my third time going through, I'm like not understanding certain things, especially around ring wraiths. And because I had a harder time with the ring wraiths this time around than I ever had in the past, of like, they really couldn't nab these 4 hobbits, huh? It was like that difficult for them. Like,
the tree in the forest got one of them, or maybe a couple of them. So.
The tree got Merry and Pippin, yeah.
But the ring wraiths who can move around. The ring wraiths are like the stormtroopers.
They're very stormtrooper-esque, where it's like they're like dangerous but never actually do anything dangerous, except for Weathertop, which is a scene I really like. I like when Frodo gets stabbed.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like as old school as these books are, Tolkien does do a good job with the stakes of everything. Like, I kind of forgot. I always was like, oh, all these characters are the best at everything and can never die. But, like, when the hobbits were left on their own, they almost died. And then even with Aragorn, like, Frodo got stabbed with black magic. It's like Gandalf dies. It's like there's Boromir, their own member of the company, gets tempted and attacks Frodo. You know, like, all these things do happen. Like, the stakes are played with and are very high, and so I get that moment with at Weathertop when the ring wraith stabbed Frodo, but then they just ran away when they saw fire. It was like, you have these cursed evil blades and they can't even kill a hobbit. Like, the hobbit just holds out for however long it is. Like, I don't know, it's like they explain it all, like Aragorn rubbed some herbs on him and then they made it to Rivendell and whatever, but still, it's like, you think if it was a cursed blade that it would kill you just instantly. Like, it's a pretty lame curse that it's like it will kill you very slowly over a long period of time. There was something about how it didn't get to the
non-cursed blade.
Yeah, seriously. They explained how like it was working towards his heart or something, and I forget exactly what was going on there. But anyway, it's just those kinds of moments where I'm like, yeah. But that's not really the point of Lord of the Rings anyway. It's
no, I mean, minor
bad.
Things. That's the thing,
minor.
right? Like, part of the issue is the stuff we were just talking about with the, could we know more about the ring and stuff like that? We know enough to know it's really, really bad if this falls into the wrong hands.
Right.
And I think maybe that's enough, as long as, the only time that they solve any problems with the ring, it's basically by going invisible, which is something that is hard magic in a weird way. It's
Right.
like, you put the ring on, if you're Frodo, you go invisible.
Or Bilbo.
Or Bilbo. Yes, the stakes are it can be as high as you want, but if you put that ring on, you might be able to slip away by going invisible.
Right.
But yeah, and I mean that's hard magic system. How you can solve a problem with it.
Yeah.
But
It's a minor nitpick. I mean, it's the idea of the ring is so cool, and it's such an epic story that I love it all. It's just one of those things, and when you read it for the third time, that you're like, it's just something I never kind of got past, but it's so mild. One of the things I'm curious about before we run out of time, what did you think of all the like songs and poetry and all that stuff?
it was interesting. I'll say they don't drive the plot forward at all. I mean, not that they're supposed to. And there's a charm to it. I'm not dying to start getting more songs in the novels that I'm consuming. I think I would see those italics start coming up. Like I'd turn a page and I'd be like, oh, all right, like buckle up, Dylan. Here we go with another one of these.
Right.
I mean, it is some of that reveling in the world building, and I'm more of a character person, and maybe more plot than world building too. So I could give or take them.
Those songs have no plot and no character development. So
no, except there was one about Galadriel, I think, right?
Yeah, I mean, I have no problems going on record saying that those aren't for me, and that I don't get anything out of them. Like, I'm fine with them being there, but I kind of glaze over them. You know, originally I'd be like, is there clues in this? Is there something happening? But it's like, no, dude, it's just something fun that Tolkien wrote, and it is based on history that you can go back and read in the Legendarium or whatever. But it's like, well, I don't need to do that stuff. Like, as many times as I've read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, I've never picked up the Silmarillion or Legendarium or read any annotations. I'm just not interested in going that deep. I think what makes Lord of the Rings good is that stuff exists. I think by having a world that's that fleshed out and built makes the story that much more alive and epic in scale, but that doesn't mean I need to go back and read it all and know it all. It just becomes too much like I'm reading a textbook and steering away from the story. So I don't get involved in any of that stuff, honestly.
I mean, different strokes for different folks.
That's one of those things that really you don't see in modern fantasy anymore. No. There's like maybe one song if a song is important to the plot or whatever, but characters like your main character, who's like your like ranger character, won't just bust out in song all of a sudden. Like, that's just not a thing that will happen anymore. These like manly characters just be like, I remember a time of a woman so fair. It's like that you'd read that nowadays and you'd be like, that's
Gimli
so
busted out a song at one point
where it's like, tell us about like Moria, and he's like, well.
Someone should make a Lord of the Rings musical.
I'm sure many have tried. I'm sure there's probably a bunch of screenplays out there.
Oh, so funny. Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things though, right? Some people are gonna love that kind of stuff, and if that's something you're looking for, then Lord of the Rings is still going to be the best place to find it. It's not like there's been some spin-off subgenre in fantasy that's gone way in on the singing that I know of anyway.
No.
So there's aspects of this that are unlike anything else, which is amazing considering that everything else in the genre is copying it to some degree.
Right. Nope, that's true. We're nearing the end of the show. Is there anything you wanted to bring up about these books?
I kind of want to talk about Tom Bombadil. But
yes, that's what I wanted to talk about too. I was like, I don't know if I want to end the show on Tom Bombadil, but we need to have a Tom Bombadil discussion.
Well, it feels like it fits in with some of the song stuff.
Yeah, this idea of like gratuitous world building. It's like, speaking of that, let's talk about Tom Bombadil. I feel like, okay, here's my thoughts on Tom Bombadil. I think the only reason people like him now is that because the movies are so prevalent and everyone knows the movies, and Tom Bombadil's just not even a whisper in the movies. Even the extended edition, Peter Jackson was like a hard pass on Tom. So I think you'd had to have read the books. So I think everyone kind of says Tom, like, references Tom Bombadil as a rallying cry of camaraderie, like, we read the books and only we understand Tom Bombadil. Like, he's like one of the only characters that like only book readers would know, you know. So it's one of those things that I think people just like to like him, but my thing is all like, is he all that great in the first place? Like, I get that we like, it's a fun name and it's like, yeah, only book readers know Tom Bombadil, but it's like, there's a reason, in my opinion, a very valid reason, that he's not even a whisper in the movies.
For sure. I don't think he would have had much of a place in the movies, and you could have a conversation about the extent to which he had a place in the books. I think part of me enjoyed Tom Bombadil. I mean, just that it was so strange. The scenes with, and I remember so we're in the forest a long time, right?
Right.
And then Bombadil comes along, and then Bombadil takes them back to his place, and then we're kind of in Bombadil's place for a long time.
Yes.
Then we leave Bombadil's place, and we're still in the forest. It feels like it's been a really long time at that point. And then we're going off, and then they call Tom Bombadil again. I'm like, oh my, we're still doing the Bombadil thing. Yeah. I can't believe we're still doing Bombadil.
Yes.
It goes on so long.
And then he comes back and you're like, no. I thought we were out of here. I thought we were leaving. And they're like, hooray, it's Tom Bombadil. And I'm like, yay. I feel like there's all that stuff in between leaving the Shire to maybe getting to Bree, but I would say even getting to Rivendell. That is for lack of a better word, don't hate me, fans, is the biggest chore of the whole trilogy. It's like, look, if you can read that Crick Hollow, Old Forest, Tom Bombadil section and get to Bree and Weathertop and finally to Rivendell, when you can finally get to Rivendell, it's like, oh, I know where we are now, and there's actually like story progressing. We've got the company now. We've got the real characters here, not these like bizarro characters that exist like outside of the rules of every other character that can like put the ring on and talk to trees, and you're like, what is happening in the world? Like even Radagast the Brown gets put in the Hobbit movies, but Tom Bombadil gets nothing because he's such a bizarre outlier thing. So weird. Not a big Tom Bombadil fan. I like saying the name. It's a great name, but beyond that, not a fan.
I think I appreciated Bombadil as an, I don't know, almost like the idea of Tom Bombadil coming in from only having seen the movies and then being like, I can't believe this whole thing is in these books.
It's
like,
also funny to have a character that just breaks the system of everything. It's like, oh, that's Tom Bombadil. He's like omnipresent. He's a force of nature, but he can't get involved in this.
It's so strange. And I do think that they made the right decision by a large margin to exclude all this Bombadil stuff from the movies. But I see its value in its kind of like fun, almost like campiness for people who've only read the books, like you're talking about.
Yeah.
And it was an experience. Like, right, we're talking about it, right? Both of us felt like we couldn't end our episode on the Fellowship of the Ring without talking about Tom Bombadil. So there's something there in terms of like making us feel something that means there's some value, I guess, to Bombadil. It definitely felt like it dragged on so long.
Yes,
But
it's my
it's
least
interesting.
favorite part of the reading experience is that segment of the books, but it's one of those things that you just can't. It's like, yeah, that's a great series. Tom Bombadil part, so like, that was a segment.
What was going on? Yeah, like,
You know?
I
So-
think it'd be interesting coming to the Lord of the Rings for the first time with no prior knowledge, and then reading, and you're like halfway through the book at this point,
yes, you're
and
hundreds of pages in.
maybe more, and like Bombadil's coming back again. You're like, what's going on with this book? I mean, this Bombadil thing. It's amazing thinking
He's like a
that
main character now.
for a very, very long time, The Lord of the Rings was a book series without a movie that people loved.
Yes.
And the only form that they were taking it in had tons of Bombadil in it.
Yes. Yeah. Very true. We live in a world where they tried to erase Bombadil from history.
But we
In the
won't let that
movies.
happen, Charles.
No, Bombadil is real. He was in many scenes. He saved Merry and Pippin from the tree, and then he saved them
Yeah.
all from something else, like more trees or something.
There's a lot of trees in that forest.
I mean, it was his forest, so he just kind of he can control the trees when he's near them, but he lets them eat hobbits anyway. But no, that's
Yeah,
Tom
can't have eyes on
Bombadil.
everything.
Oh, yeah, we're big Tom Bombadil fans. It's just funny that he exists, and his like history in like the Lord of the Rings, where it's like they wrote him out of the movies.
Charles, are you a fan of Tom Bombadil in the same way that you give Felicia Day's reviews 5 stars on our review of the reviews episodes?
Yeah, I mean Tom Bombadil is iconic, but he doesn't, how impactful is it? I don't know. Could we know more? Maybe, but we don't need to. So, no, I like the idea of Bombadil being almost like this troll character that only exists in the books. Is a fun thing. So, Tom Bombadil.
It is fun.
It is.
I
fun.
think that I would dislike Bombadil if he was in the movies.
Yeah,
But the fact that I got to be like,
I can't even imagine
having this weird
he would
experience
like
with him in
wreck
the
the whole
books.
tone of the movies. He would like,
Oh, for
like,
sure.
How do you even picture like, okay, this is a guy that like wears ragged clothes and like sings and dances and and they have feasts and stuff and he talks to trees. It's like, how do you make that in this tone of the movies where every character's like cool and stoic and like says all these cool deep things like, the ring bearer, come forth. It's time to go on a quest. And it's like, oh, I'm Tom Bombadil. I like the flowers and the trees. There's no place in the movies.
I'm sure someone had to have asked Peter Jackson about.
It's like, so who are you going to cast as Tom Bombadil? And he's like, gonna not.
I want to hear him talk about why he didn't include Tom Bombadil. I want to see if he
sure there is. If I Google like Peter Jackson, Tom Bombadil, something will come up.
I'd just love to hear him be like, what do you think? Why do you think I didn't include Tom Bombadil?
Well, we'll have to do some research and find out. The only other thing I would say is talking about characters that kind of overrated maybe would be Aragon in this book. He doesn't quite do it for me, where it's like, wait, is he the king of all men or is he a ranger? Like, why would he be a ranger in the first place? Like, why does he choose now to kind of step up? What can and can't he do? It fell very much into like the ring wraiths and Aragon and like all those kinds of things where it's like, okay, I have no problem accepting that this is what's happening and I think it's really cool. But if I was this Strider character, I don't know why I would be outranging all the time if I was the one to be king. And like, I don't know why I would expect that I could just decide to be king whenever I want and it would happen, you know? And so that was the only other character that I was like, take or leave.
That's fair. I don't know. I liked that this Strider thing got fleshed out more in the books. In the movies, it's like, what? Why would they call him Strider? That's Aragorn. Like, it's pretty confusing, but the way it's introed in the books feels more natural. So I like that. And I guess you get more of a sense of what Aragorn's role as a ranger in the company would be in the books. Like, you kind of have this thing where Gandalf is the leader for a while, even though I guess Frodo technically is. And then Aragorn is kind of the person who's like, we should go this way. But end of the day, it's probably Gandalf's call what they're actually going to do. So this bit about being the king, yeah, I'm also kind of fuzzy on what exactly is going on in the books around that, and his motivations and stuff aren't super fleshed out. But I didn't particularly think, oh, Aragorn is so overrated in the Fellowship of the Ring books. But maybe I'm not in those discussions where people are rating him as much as you are, Charles.
Yeah, I mean, I love Aragon. I love this. I love these whole series. It's just another one of those like random nitpicky things. After reading the books 3 times, it's like for all this, like when you compare to like Gandalf and Frodo and Bilbo and like all these other like characters, and then you have Aragon, and you're like, okay, Aragon is just kind of deciding that he's gonna step up now, and it's like it didn't have as much resonance with me this time around as a lot of the other characters did.
That's fair.
And I mean, we never talked about
anything
Frodo,
else?
but big Frodo fan here. So
You're a big Frodo guy over there, Charles?
I think this is one of his stronger books because he actually goes through and I think it's interesting that in the movies they go into like the orcs attacking and Merry and Pippin getting abducted, where in the books that hasn't happened yet, and they just have Frodo leaving. And I like that in the sense that it kind of arced Frodo's kind of transition from becoming a passive protagonist, or like Gandalf's telling him what to do, Elrond's telling him what to do, Aragorn's telling him what to do, Tom Bombadil's telling him what to do, and then he decides for himself, like, you know what, it's time for me to, like, I can see this not going well, I need to do my own thing. And then he goes, and then he decides, like, oh, Sam, come on, get in the boat and let's go. Where he's finally calling the shots and going off. So I thought that was like a good end to the Fellowship of having that kind of arc for Frodo. And it was one of the few characters that actually did go through like this change in this arc, where most of the characters kind of were still the same.
That's a good point. I did feel like the ending felt a little abrupt.
Yeah, I can agree.
It makes sense with a few pieces of context. One is that you said Tolkien viewed this as all one book, basically.
And like he wrote like 6 books that he wanted to be kind of in one collection, and then the publishers were like, "No, we're gonna release 3 books."
Okay, so there's that, and then there's me coming in waiting for Boromir to die in this book. If I'm not misremembering the movies, Boromir dies in the Fellowship of the Ring movie.
Yep.
So I always think of that when I think of the end of that. So then I'm like, I was watching the book run out of pages, and I was like, unless they're going to really glaze over that fight scene, which wouldn't have shocked me, then Boromir is going to make it through this one. And he did. So it felt a little abrupt, I think, from my context.
No, yeah, I agree. It certainly didn't have that like climactic action scene, you know. I guess it was like Boromir confronting Frodo, which was kind of like a scary moment where it's like Frodo realizes he's like alone with Boromir and Boromir's like not acting right. It's a very interesting part of the show, of
Yeah.
the series. I mean, they were hinting at it. Like he wrote so many times like Boromir gave a weird glancing look at Frodo, like eyeing Frodo. You're like, okay, that's should keep an eye out on Boromir, I suppose. But yeah, I think it did end rather abruptly. I remember being like 98% of the way into the book. I'm like, really? But we're just getting in these boats. So I think like we just got here. There's still all this stuff like the orcs have to attack, and Merry and Pippin have to get abducted, and Boromir has to fight get hit with the arrows, and all that stuff. But I was actually okay with it. I thought kind of to focus on Frodo and Frodo deciding to like that important decision, because I feel like in the movies it almost was like forced because the orcs attacked that they got separated and Frodo just had no time to lose and had to go.
That's always how I thought of it.
Right. So I think by pushing that to the next book and focusing on making this Frodo's conscious decision to go without the driving force of an orc raid contributes greatly to Frodo's character and like just the arc of his story. So I did appreciate it for that. It did feel like we were getting shortchanged in terms of action, but that stuff's coming, it's not going anywhere. It's just the conscious decision of making this Frodo's choice versus another passive thing Frodo had to do to avoid getting killed or whatever. So I liked it for that. I
get that. I think if I didn't have the context of the movies, it wouldn't have been jarring, how abrupt it seemed, the ending there. Right. And it's good that Frodo gets to make a choice. He did decide to head back to Tom Bombadil's forest, right?
I mean,
that's the first
if
half
I was him,
of the
that's
Two
what
Towers.
I think you're confusing him with one of Mary's horses. Actually, they decided.
Doesn't he ride Mary's horse back to Tom Bombadil?
Maybe.
And that's the first half of the Two Towers, I'm assuming.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, I think we did it here. Is there anything else you want to say before we part ways with Lord of the Rings: Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien?
Thanks for listening, everyone.
Yes, everyone. Thank you so much for listening. I guess I'm just going to go ahead and start playing us out. Thank you, everybody, as always, for giving us a listen. This was Book 1 of The Lord of the Rings. Thank you so much. And as always, go forth and conquer, friends.